This is a production of Cornell University.
Okay, so good to be here, and sorry I haven't made it earlier. So yeah, I've been working with the soil health program with Harold Van Ass and others for the past 20-something years, and around the state and the region. A lot of people know me as a soils guy, soil health guy, or I also do a lot of stuff with water management. Other people know me as the climate change guy, because I've also been doing that work, climate change in agriculture, for the last 20 years, 25 years or so. And you know, it's particularly as this interest in carbon farming has been developing, those two worlds have really come together. And so this talk is really bringing together soil health and what you've been learning about that, and talking about that, to this issue of climate change resilience, farmers coping with upcoming changes in the climate, and also mitigation. What can farms do to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and sequester carbon in soils? So this is a little cartoon showing all the ups and downs of the three key greenhouse gases affecting our climate today, which we'll focus on: nitrous oxide, N2O, methane, CH4, and of course CO2. And you've got the soil carbon piece there, and there's CO2 coming out of the soil. But of course, a very important thing about farms, and this also applies to natural vegetation and agroforestry, is there's the CO2 uptake by the vegetation. And when you think about agriculture, you know, today, every industry has some level of concern about their carbon footprint, right? Their greenhouse gas emissions due to either public relations issues or regulations. Agriculture is highly unique, perhaps only compared to forestry, in terms of we are an industry that can literally suck CO2 out of the atmosphere, natural geoengineering, I call it. And so that's something we talk to our farmers about, that actually, you know, this is an ecosystem service that agriculture is playing, and how do we maximize that CO2 uptake, which can compensate for some greenhouse gas emissions that are almost really hard to completely eliminate in an agriculture system, et cetera. So we'll get into some of that. This is a slightly dated pie chart, but this is looking at the basic trend is the same today. This is looking, if you look at just kind of the on-farm emissions on a CO2 equivalent basis, the three key greenhouse gases: nitrous oxide, CO2, and methane. Because nitrous oxide is almost 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide on a molecule per molecule basis in terms of its greenhouse gas warming potential, and methane is about 25 times more potent. You can see that when we look at it on that sort of equivalent basis, the big culprit in terms of US, and this is true for many developing nations, the big culprit on the farm emissions is nitrous oxide. So that's a big story for us. Before I go on, so let's talk about nitrous oxide, for example. Where is that nitrous oxide being emitted from on farms? Who's emitting that on the farm? Well, let's start with the easy one, CO2. Where is there some CO2 emissions on a farm? Huh?
Soil.
What was that?
Soil.
The soil, okay, the soil. And who in the soil is emitting that? Microbes. It could be everything, and not only microbes, earthworms, everything that's aerobic and respires in the soil. So even macrofauna and microbes. What else? What's another emission of CO2 on farms? Huh? Animals, yeah, animals breathing, aerobic animals. What else? What about, we all emit CO2 with something we do. What is that? Tractor driving, vehicles, and that sort of thing. Let's go to nitrous oxide. So who on the farm is emitting nitrous oxide? Not coming out of our tractors that much, huh?
Soil.
Okay, and who in the soil? This is almost exclusively microbes. And actually a small number of microbes, really just those involved in nitrogen cycling, denitrifiers, nitrifiers, etc. Okay, methane. Who's emitting methane on the farm? So someone said animals, like ruminant animals are famous for this, cows burping out methane. But who in the animals, there's something inside the animals that's emitting that, and that's microbes in their guts, right? And anybody know what those microbes are called that release methane? Methanogens, yeah, somebody's got it, methanogens. So it's a large group of different species by methanogens. Almost all of this, my point is, a large fraction of this is microbial, actually. And CO2 is, while farms are emitting CO2 with the tractor driving and et cetera, that's not the big story for agriculture in terms of, in terms of agricultural responsibility for greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. There's a lot more CO2 emitted by all of us driving our cars and heating our homes and all kinds of things. The big story for agriculture really is the nitrous oxide and methane. And much of that happens in the soil, really, because there's also wet soils will release methane, et cetera. So as I said, if we were to talk about, which sectors of society are responsible for CO2 emissions, it would mostly be transportation of all kinds, ourselves transporting ourselves around, industry, et cetera. Agriculture would be a small part of the CO2 emissions globally. But when it comes to methane and nitrous oxides, here's the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, kind of a pie chart globally, some of the major sectors of society emitting those things. And you can see agriculture is not a minor component of methane and nitrous oxide emissions. We mentioned the ruminant animals. That's this pie, 27%. That's their methanogens in their guts. These methanogens are anaerobic. So the methanogens, they basically breathe in carbon dioxide for their oxygen, for their electron transport chain, and they breathe out methane. So they're anaerobic, and this is why would then rice production? Can anybody figure out why rice production then is part of a methane issue? Flooded soils that are anaerobic, low oxygen, so there's lots of methane emission from flooded rice production. Of course, there's ways of trying to reduce the amount of flooding in rice production. A lot of people are working on that now. And there's some other things, but you can see a big factor there. Also, anytime any soil is flooded, because methanogens are very ubiquitous. A regular farm that's not growing rice, if it's flooded for long periods of time, there can be some methane emissions. And wet animal manures. So you've got a dairy barn, and maybe you wash out the dairy barn with lots of water, and there's urine and dry manure that goes somewhere, and it's soaking wet, it's anaerobic. There's a lot of methane emissions, not just from the cows that made the manure, but now from the wet manure. Nitrogen fertilization, you can see, is a huge feature, and she probably already talked about this. Have we talked about this in terms of nitrogen management and adapt in a little bit, or any of that been touched on yet? Okay, well, roughly, about 1% of the nitrogen that goes into farm soils for nitrogen fertilizer, whether it's manure, organic source, or whether it's synthetic nitrogen fertilizer bought from a store, roughly about 1% of that is lost into the atmosphere, kind of a loss from the system. As the microbes break down that nitrogen and put it into forms that roots can take up, some of it is lost as this gas, nitrous oxide. So the less nitrogen we put on, the less nitrous oxide that is emitted worldwide. Of course, we have to use some nitrogen to produce our crops, so we can't eliminate that entirely, but it is another rationale for being very judicious and careful about nitrogen management on farms. There's another environmental quality issue that we've been talking about for many decades with nitrogen management, which is what?
Runoff.
Huh?
Runoff.
Runoff of what? Leaching of what? Nitrate, NO3. A water-soluble form. It's not a gas, but nitrate leaching. So we've been talking about that for many years in terms of water quality. It's another incentive for farmers to be judicious about nitrogen management, basically, is this new thing we're recognizing about how crucial agriculture is in terms of nitrous oxide as a source of our climate change problem we're having. Okay, here's a sort of a little bit of kind of, you might say, simplified chemistry of what's happening with these three key greenhouse gases and how it relates to where they come from, and gets into this story of soil health and these stories. So we mentioned that there's CO2 emissions as organic matter is decomposed in soils. And I mentioned, you know, as I said, earthworms can actually start this process, but also there's all kinds of microbes that get involved, fungi, et cetera, all kinds of aerobic organisms. So the decomposers that take organic matter in soil and break it down are breathing in CO2. And you can see in this formula at the top, the CH2OX is representing organic matter of all types, plus oxygen, requires oxygen. The little arrow then shows where it goes, but that little arrow is microbial mediated. So those animals, those microbes, eat the organic matter, they breathe oxygen as part of their respiration, and they give off CO2. Now that CO2 goes back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So now that was organic matter that was storing carbon in our soil, and now it's going back up into the atmosphere as the greenhouse gas CO2. So that's something to think about. We talk about reducing tillage to keep organic matter in soils, right? We've talked about that already. Reducing tillage is one way to build up organic matter, kind of slow this process down. And sometimes there's confusion. People think that, well, the tillage story in organic matter is all about like breaking up fungal hyphae, and there's that issue. And yes, some of that's true, but a big thing about tillage and its relationship to building up organic matter in soils is you don't over-oxygenate the soil. You can see the more O2 we pump into the soil, such as any kind of tillage operation, the more you move things that way. And of course, we do need our organic matter. We do need some of it to be broken down in terms of making the nutrients that are contained in that organic matter available to plants. But we don't want to go too fast and too quickly that way, because then the organic matter disappears from our soil faster than our plants can use the products of organic matter. So that's why tillage, reducing tillage, helps store carbon in soils. Now let's look at the nitrogen story. This is a very simplified cartoon version of what happens as we have like organic matter, biota. It gets converted by some microbes that are involved in just getting it into the ammonia form. Some of that can go up as a volatile, but some of it can also be taken up in the liquid form by plant roots. There's another bit of microbial activity here that puts it into the nitrate form, that water-soluble form. We have to have some on that ammonia and nitrate form for plants to take it up. They don't take up, plants don't take up organic matter through their roots. They get their nitrogen that way. So thank goodness we have these microbes that do this, or else we wouldn't have recycling of nitrogen and there would be no nitrogen for our plants. But you can see I have this N2O coming off here and there. And that's the loss. There's some losses in this system. A volatile nitrous oxide goes off. So the more manure you put on the field, the more you push it this way. Yes, you get more ammonium and nitrate that your plants can take up. Good for you, good for the crop. But you also get more nitrous oxide emissions. So yes, you want to put on enough manure or enough synthetic nitrogen to directly put on ammonium or nitrate. Good for your crops. But you're going to get the microbes doing their thing here, and you're going to get some N2O emissions. And so we just don't want to overdo it. You've got to do some of that to grow crops, but if you overdo it, as I said, roughly, it varies very much by the details, 1% of the nitrogen that's applied as manure or ammonium nitrate gets lost as this. So we want to be very judicious. One other thing I want to mention is this part here is an aerobic process, and denitrification is where you get some of the biggest N2O losses. And this is an anaerobic. Flooded soils is where you get denitrification losses. Around here in the Northeast, I assume, I don't know how many of you are from the Northeast, but a place like the Northeast, we have a time of year when soils tend to be particularly flooded. Anybody know when that would be in terms of the Northeast? We get a lot of our nitrous oxide emissions from denitrification.
Spring.
Spring, and why is that? Spring thaw. The spring thaw, we have flooded soils. Sometimes a third of an agricultural field's total annual nitrous oxide emissions come off during the spring thaw. Yeah. So anyway, that also has a lot of things to do with details of nitrogen management we're not going to get into today. Finally, methane emissions, all done by methanogens. There are many different species of methanogens, but they are these organisms that literally breathe in what we breathe out, but that oxygen is formed, it serves the same purpose as oxygen serves for us. It's in their electron transport chain, important for the metabolism, and they breathe out methane. Any anaerobic environment, and there's methanogens are all over the place, in every soil out here, anywhere, and in the guts of animals, the ruminant animals. Anaerobic wet soils and manures, digestive tract of ruminant animals, all of those places. Natural wetlands give off methane. Natural wetlands, because they are totally so. Of course, natural wetlands do store a lot of carbon as the plant material in a wetland. Natural wetland dies and decomposes. It goes to the bottom and stays there because it's anaerobic there. That's not decomposed. There's a lot of carbon, kind of compensates, carbon storage in wetlands. That compensates a little bit for the methane emissions. But anyway, all those environments. So this is just kind of, so you have kind of a little depth of understanding about these three key greenhouse gases that are happening in our soils, in our animals, and agricultural systems. Just quickly, another little, a couple of things to emphasize again, the nitrogen cycle and where that nitrous oxide emission stuff is coming from. So we have plant biomass, we have decomposers that begin the process of degrading some of that plant biomass, starting with earthworms and fungi, then getting to microbials. Then we have organic matter, which has nitrogen in it. We have microbes that will attack that pretty quickly and turn it into ammonium. We have and again, the plant roots can take that up. We have a few species of microorganisms that can change the ammonium to nitrate. Again, plants can take that up. So that's all good, kind of a recycling thing. But we do have these losses from the system. In this process, we can have some nitrous oxide emissions as this process goes on. Some microbes do this. Some of it actually goes up into the air. This is a volatile. As we have anaerobic soils, flooded soils, we get denitrification, goes back up to N2 gas, but some is lost as nitrous oxide. And then, of course, we talked about the leaching of the actual nitrate from soils. So, now, where do we get the nitrogen to keep this whole thing going? We've got all these nitrogen losses. How do we keep, we're losing nitrogen here. Some's going up, export and harvest. Some's going back into the air as N2, leaching. So how do we keep our crops growing?
Nitrogen fixation.
Huh?
Nitrogen fixation.
Nitrogen fixation would be like having a legume crop up there. So either this itself is a legume providing some nitrogen to the system to replenish it, or we have rotation with legumes, or we actually use synthetic nitrogen, or we use some kind of manure or an addition of fertilizer. So what I wanted to point out about, again, our carbon footprint of agriculture, and this gets a little bit away from the strictly soil part of it. The strictly soil part of it is what I just was talking about. All nitrogen fertilizers give off nitrous oxide as a potent greenhouse gas as they degrade in soil. So we can't get away from that. And it only means, let's be judicious, give them just what they need. There's another part of the carbon footprint. If you are not using manures, but you're going and buying synthetically manufactured nitrogen fertilizers, there can be 4 to 6 tons of carbon dioxide emitted per ton of nitrogen manufactured. So if you're a farmer And you don't want to mess around with organic sources, legumes in rotation, or you don't want to mess around with manure. Just going to go go to Agway and buy your synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. Just by going to make that purchase, you have a carbon footprint associated with the energy, the CO2 emissions associated with that input. So that's another way to look at the carbon footprint of farming systems, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time with today because we're focusing on soils, but just to think about another piece of the carbon footprint of agriculture is not just what happens really on the farm with the soils and the animals, the ruminant animals, et cetera, but also there's the energy embedded in some of the inputs. So fertilizers, if you look at the story in terms of CO2 emissions and farms, a lot of the CO2 emissions from farms are not talking, this is not talking about nitrous oxide emissions, this is talking about the manufacture of fertilizers producing CO2. So this is fertilizer you bring into the farm from somewhere else. There was a lot of CO2 emitted for that. And it's a big feature of the carbon footprint of farms. So something else to think about when we think about the full picture of agriculture and climate change. This is why I haven't talked about adaptation yet?
Not really,
Oh,
we've
well.
just mostly done soil health that.
Okay. So, Harold Van Essen and others have been very involved over years in developing a highly efficient tool for getting at, really giving farmers good guidance on, this is particularly focused on side dressing corn with nitrogen, making sure you're giving them just what they need. And it takes account of, for example, by taking weather data, soil temperature data, how much of that natural soil nitrogen cycling has been going on. And so you're not providing, if there's been a lot, if you've had warm spring, for example, with warm soils, you probably have more nitrogen mineralization, et cetera. So you've got more kind of free nitrogen from soil. You can put on less nitrogen fertilizer. All of this is about judicious use of nitrogen fertilizer. So it's kind of part of the soil health story and reducing nitrous oxide emissions is using new tools like this to be judicious about that. This is some data from a farm up in Canada, just showing an example of a mixed animal crop production system. There's a dairy farm. And here's looking at some of the different types of operations and aspects to the farm. As I mentioned, CO2 is considered in all of these calculations about CO2 equivalents and greenhouse gas emissions. We put everything on this CO2 equivalent basis. It's given a value of 1. So there's some direct, when you're tilling the soil, you're oxygenating the soil, stimulating microbial breakdown of organic matter, and CO2 goes up, so there's stuff there. The ruminants breathe out, the animals breathe out CO2 as well as breathing out methane, et cetera. So there's some CO2 there. Nitrous oxide, excess nitrogen fertilizer, poor timing and placement, all of this nitrogen management. It's a big part of the N2O story. And methane, we've got the ruminant emissions, which are all kind of famous now, but also poor manure management can lead to methane emissions. If you have there's a lot of strategies to do better manure management, to reduce methane emissions from manure management. Also, there's things about different diets for ruminant animals to reduce those, but again, it's a little bit off the soil health story, so I'm not going to go into that. The main thing here is it's not all about CO2 and tractor driving, and it's not even about soil organic matter decomposition. There's the other two gases are quite important in agricultural, particularly mixed animal crop production systems. You'll recognize that photo? Sometimes I show this photo when I go to policy meetings in DC and see if they can recognize that. But when I see that, I see carbon, nitrogen, and energy. So I don't know what you guys see. But we have, I used to teach, today Matt Ryan here teaches a cropping systems ecology class, but I used to teach that and used to say, your people before you, a lot of people from Cornell worked hard to, because of the aspects of production to scale, et cetera, decoupling animal and crop production systems. The challenge today is recoupling these systems so we don't have a lot of manure that just goes truly to waste and is just a problem, a water quality problem, et cetera, and really thinking about using this for energy, for compost, as we heard about, and other things to regather that stuff. And there's a lot of work, Harold mentioned this too, about we're working hard to make sure these things are getting recoupled better. So soil health. So all of these things that I've got down here, building soil organic matter, pretty key to soil health. Reducing tillage, already explained the nitty gritty of why that works so well. Winter cover crops, that's just, the more time we have in the year of sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere, it's good for reducing greenhouse gases in the air, and it's good for that. A lot of that CO2 ends up as organic matter in the soil. Using manures and compost, as we just heard about the previous speaker. I'll mention something about biochar, perennial crops, all of these. Increase organic matter. That is an adaptation to climate change. Farmers are seeing more and less predictable drought and flooding. Soils that are high in organic matter tend to be better drained and also in a flooding event and also hold more water. And so this helps build resilience to climate change. And by the way, it's storing carbon in the soil that otherwise would be in the air as CO2. So farmers are mostly interested. There's a big drive now for farmers to improve soil health. Much of it has to do with this aspect, build the resilience of farms. But there's also a lot of interest now in policymakers in terms of giving farmers some credit for what they're doing for the ecosystem beyond the farm. And that has to do with the storing carbon in soils. So we already heard a lot about compost. So one way, of course, is to literally add organic matter and carbon to soils in terms of doing this story of rebuilding soil health and also storing carbon in soils. It's usually, if you put on lots of compost, you can probably make the most difference most quickly in terms of strategies compared to reducing tillage or using cover crops. But only some small scale farmers are doing what we call as deep compost, where you're literally putting on tons and tons of compost on small plots. You can build up a lot of organic matter quickly. But even doing it in more reasonable amounts definitely helps maintain organic matter in soils and is part of the soil health story in terms of claiming a positive thing that agriculture does to compensate for perhaps some of those inevitable emissions that are just part of, like any industry has some inevitable carbon footprint to it. In agriculture, it's hard to think of having a successful farm where there's not some nitrous oxide emissions due to nitrogen fertilizer use, and et cetera, and some methane emissions, obviously, if you are using ruminant livestock, et cetera. But we can compensate for that by things like this. Again, other industries do not have ways to really sequester carbon away, and so it's really unique about agriculture, a very positive thing. Biochar, has everybody here, most of you heard about biochar, right? Have you talked about that in the course at all? Yeah, no, we haven't. Well, so just to quickly review, and there's a person here, Johannes Lehmann, who's really one of the international gurus on biochar, but I'll quickly say a couple things about it. Essentially, I think the ideal angle to biochar is it's a way of burning waste materials and turning them into a sort of like a compost, but burning them in a special way, burning them in a kind of a low oxygen, slow burn type of process, very low oxygen environment. And the end result is that you get heat energy like you would from burning wood in a wood stove, but with much less CO2 emissions. So first of all, the actual creation of biochar from waste is a way to get energy by getting rid of waste and a lot of BTUs, a lot of energy per unit of CO2 that goes up in the atmosphere. A lot of the carbon, instead of going up in the atmosphere as CO2, typically as when you burn something in a high oxygen environment, a lot of it stays. And so you end up with this kind of charcoal-like material that's very high in carbon. In fact, it's virtually entirely carbon. And a large fraction of the carbon that was in the original waste is still there. The interesting thing about this carbon is even more than compost, the carbon that's there is extremely stable. Depends on the compost exactly, and it depends on different papers have shown different stuff, and it's hard to know exactly, but we're talking about you put this material into a soil as carbon, and it's likely to stay there for 500 years. I mean, it's not active carbon. It's the exact opposite of active carbon. That's one of the soil health indicators. That's carbon that's really readily available to the soil microbial food web. And it's really good for feeding the microbes that you want to benefit the soil. Biochar is not going to feed the microbial food web, but it has a couple of features with it. First of all, it is storing away carbon for a long time. So a lot of policymakers are really high on this, thinking let's take all of our waste and turn it into biochar. We'll bury it in all this excess CO2 in the atmosphere. We'll bury it in our soils. But what it does for soil is a couple things. It is just carbon. Some people think it's like a magic thing you put in there and plants grow faster. No, it's just carbon by itself. But it has a high cation exchange capacity, like clays and humus do. So nutrients in the soil can attach to it, or you can nutrient enrich it before you, not just put pure biochar in there, but nutrient enrich it. For example, Johannes is looking into a system of taking manure waste and nutrient enriching biochar with manure waste, and then putting it in the soil. Then you have something that's actually nutrient rich. The other thing two other things that are beneficial about biochar in soil is it does help improve somewhat soil structure, water holding capacity and such, and drainage. And there's been some studies showing it creates a neat habitat for beneficial soil microbes like mycorrhizae. So it's a very interesting thing. It's at the cutting edge, sort of. It's not really broadly available, but here at Cornell, Johannes has a very big pyrolysis unit, which is kind of a very sophisticated way to make biochar, and something coming down the pike, and something to know about.
With respect to back to biochar, you have to be very careful about how we add biochar to the soil. If it's put on the surface and it's very fine, that high cation exchange capacity, it can attract nutrients that could be carried away in runoff.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So if you're going to put biochar on, isn't it best to incorporate it in the soil where it's not available and runoff where it can contribute to
that's a good point.
Runoff carrying nutrients due to
right. I think it's better. I think it is better incorporated into the soil. Yeah. Although again, then you're tilling and you're losing a little organic matter, but it's all a matter of compromises of systems. And I agree with what you're saying. It could end up with a high nutrient status in the very upper profile, so you have an erosion issue. Okay, so finally, I think I just 5 minutes left, and I want to get through this last series of things in which these two things are soil health and greenhouse gas mitigation are mixed. So first of all, sustaining healthy productive soils reduces the land for land clearing, deforestation for new production. So this is a big issue for developing countries where there's a lot of shallow soils in some of these tropical soils. If they aren't well managed, then you end up having to keep clearing new land. So working hard in developing nations to reduce deforestation, and all of that has to do with maintaining healthy soils. Because that's about 11% of annual human CO2 emissions are associated with deforestation. There's carbon in those trees, and it goes up in the air as they decompose. Healthy soils have better drainage, therefore they're not going to be anaerobic. They're going to be less prone to be flooded and anaerobic, so you end up with fewer nitrous oxide emissions and fewer methane emissions. Maintaining year-round vegetation cover obviously is capturing CO2 from the atmosphere, something you want to do for soil health and organic matter buildup anyway. Maximizing reliance on N fixation, legume cover crops for crop needs improves nitrogen use efficiency and reduces nitrous oxide emissions. So the more you're using legumes and that sort of thing in terms of building up soil health, the more you are reducing having to go buy synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. Healthy soils require fewer chemical inputs in general. A lot of farmers are finding this out. And all of those chemicals, whether they be a pesticide or a synthetic fertilizer, took energy to produce. There was CO2 emissions somewhere. to produce them. So fewer chemical inputs with healthy soils, less manufacture, transport costs, etc. Reducing tillage frequency, first of all, reduces the fossil fuel emissions with running tractors around to till the soil. It's good. No CO2 emissions associated with that. And of course, as we know, it tends to leave more of the organic matter carbon in the soil, upper soil profile at least. So I've got a few things on biofuel crops. That's another angle. And so instead of, this is kind of alternatively in terms of using energy that you're getting from a power plant, which is maybe burning coal or something, using biofuel crops has its advantages. It does depend on how you grow the crops. If you use a lot of fossil fuel energy to produce the biofuel crops, then obviously it doesn't work. But if you're using minimal inputs to produce biofuel crops, they're a neat alternative. And so I'm out of time now, right?
Yeah.
Okay. There's some constraints to mitigation, concerns about costs and risks of mitigation. Farmer may want to use wind turbines or reduce their nitrogen fertilizer, but they're concerned about the risk it might take in terms of reducing yields. Concerns about more labor. Is this going backward, doing things the old-fashioned way? Sometimes there's just not policy incentives or actual constraints to farmers doing some of these practices. Farmers are concerned if we start paying attention to this and doing more to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and make a big deal about how we're doing all this good stuff for climate change, is some government agency going to start coming out and measuring our nitrous oxide emissions and all of that. Difficulties in quantifying the mitigation benefits. So for example, my student that was mentioned who's doing a lot of infrared spectroscopy work and carbon has also looked at how can we monitor soils more cheaply to look at the carbon change that they're accomplishing. And there's just not carbon market incentives right now, of course, to really move this, fast forward this in a big way. So yeah, I'll stop there. It's kind of we're going to break. The time for a question or two. Yeah.
Just one simple question regarding compost and compost. Compost, we do a lot of work in food safety of fish produce. From the standpoint of fish produce, from adding lime compost, soil is good for the bathroom. But from the as a soil, from the plant nutrients, soil nutrients, composting process results in a low nitrogen content, which in most of the cases is less than 1%. So how we can...
So you're saying like relying a lot on compost, which the previous speaker focused on, can end up with kind of a lower nitrogen
content in that
lower nitrogen situation. Yeah, so I think, well, I mean, maybe the compost person should address that, our previous speaker. I would just say, I mean, that can be the case. It depends on the nature of the compost you're using and how that nitrogen, phosphorus, and other carbon-nitrogen balances and all of that. But yes, you might have to consider amending the soil with other sources of nitrogen that, more fresh manure or actual types of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, etc. So, but maybe do you have any other comments about long-term compost use that might be low in nitrogen, leading to a nitrogen, it's not enough nitrogen to really grow your crop.
Usually you need to add something else. The nitrogen that's in compost, in a finished compost, isn't going to be enough for a lot of crops. So you have to use it in conjunction with the nitrogen fixers and all the other things.
Yeah, legumes or other types of amendments, or literally other, urea or ammonium nitrate or something like that.
Yeah, I don't think anybody would claim that compost is going to provide all the nutrients for most plants.
Are there any studies on this slow release fertilizers, how they would compare with compost and stuff?
Well, the slow release fertilizers, yeah. So, I mean, I think that's another angle to reducing nitrous oxide emissions can be the slow release things you might add to nitrogen fertilizers or different types of nitrogen fertilizer sources release the nitrogen at different rates that can better match the needs of the crop as the plant grows. And so that is a good thing in terms of moving farmers away from just pouring on lots of nitrogen a lot, frequently, repeatedly, to make sure that the crop's not going to be, missing any nitrogen. And that can lead to excessive nitrogen applications and nitrous oxide emissions. So slow release nitrogen, when appropriately done and taking advantage of all it offers, can reduce nitrous oxide emissions, for sure. Yeah, so that's an alternative. Yeah.
I was working on a project in Kenya to grow beans, dry beans. And one of the things that we were doing there is they did, as far as tilling length, they did make furrows, and we microdosed. We were looking at different amendments, including biochars and composts and fertilizers and all that kind of stuff. And the compost and the biochar were microdosed into the furrow, so they were right where the seed would be able to use, where right at the site where things were needed. Mm-hmm. And that was an interesting way to apply it. It was the only way they could apply it, but it was an interesting way to do it so that it was effective.
Yeah, you can kind of get more right where the plant is, because I know I've worked with farms where we're using compost, and it's amazing. You're putting on tons, and then you go out to look at it, and you can't. It's like a fine little. You can barely see it, right? But we do have these farmers now that are with this decompost thing. I'll have to talk to you separately about this at some point. But they're putting out the vegan. It's like that, It's like, wow, okay, that'll build up your organic matter, I guess. Maybe, yeah. Yeah. No. Any other last question before you guys get to break? Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.